agent and county extension coordinator in Camden County. So not very close to DeKalb. I am familiar with DeKalb. That's actually, I was born in Northside Hospital and went to elementary school in Chamblee. It's been a while since I've been in DeKalb, but I've been working in Camden County, which, if you're not familiar, is the bottom southeast corner of Georgia, right on the Florida line, just above Jacksonville, for the last almost 8 years for extension. So one of the things, we all have different things that we're kind of specialists at, and I don't claim to be a specialist on invasive species, but that is one of the things I work on a lot and do what we call impact programming on, largely because being on the Florida line, we see a lot more invasive species. Sometimes we see them as they're moving into Georgia, or they become a problem for us first. So I've learned a lot about them over the last several years, and then also serve on some steering committees for invasive species management areas and things of that nature. So I was glad to help when Yanni asked me to speak, especially when it's a presentation I already have put together, which is always awesome. Now, I will say that in our talk tonight, I can't possibly cover every invasive species, and especially not every invasive plant species even, but I'm going to try and hit some of the big ones that you may see in your landscape, or you may be thinking about incorporating into your landscape. Some of these you may see more in South Georgia, but most of these you will see anywhere in the state. Or you may have a friend that has them and it's done well for them and they want to give it to you. That's how a lot of these things get spread. I hear a lot of people say, I've never been able to grow anything, but I can grow this. And a lot of times that should maybe make you think like, I need to look into this plant a little bit more, because if you kill everything else, but this one plant grows for you, that might mean that it's a little too tenacious. So with that, we'll get started. First, I'll do a little bit of an introduction about what makes a plant invasive. So I get this question a lot where people say, Jessica, is every non-native plant invasive? And the answer is no. So all non-native plants are not invasive plants. There are plenty of non-native ornamental plants that we have in our landscape that are not invasive at all. But an invasive plant is one that is non-native and actively displaces native species. So it's something that actually alters the ecosystem by displacing native species, causing the local environment to change. Usually invasive plant species are also going to reproduce prolifically. So they're going to have lots and lots of babies and make lots and lots of new plants. They usually don't have any predators, any natural predators. And usually that's because they're not, of course, from here. So they did not evolve with predators. They cause economic and environmental harm. So which kind of makes sense if they're taking over an ecosystem and changing that. They can cause environmental harm, obviously, but a lot of times it can also cause economic harm, whether it's in agricultural fields, forest land, or just by impacting the natural areas that we have. A lot of times, not always, but these invasive plants will utilize a longer growing season in order to outcompete the native plants. Some of them will utilize chemical warfare, which is also known as allelopathy. So basically, they'll put something out around themselves to keep other plants from growing near them. They produce many seeds, and those seeds have a high viability. So viability, if you're not familiar with that term, anytime you plant seeds, say you plant seeds in your garden, not every single seed is going to germinate. And a lot of times your seed packets will tell you what the germination rate is if used by a certain date. With invasive plants, a lot of their seeds, or most of their seeds, are going to actually germinate and become a new plant. And they usually have really successful mechanisms for dispersal too. So it's very easy for them to reproduce a lot and to spread it far and wide. A lot of these plants are going to thrive on disturbance and live in almost any habitat in harsh conditions that a lot of things might not else live in. And then I also like to put in there that invasive plants are the second largest threat to biodiversity globally. So I don't know if you're aware, but biodiversity loss globally is ranked up right as high or maybe higher actually than climate change, but it doesn't get as much media attention. There's a lot of information out there if you are interested about biodiversity loss, but basically that's the loss of different species. Biodiversity is literally, not to go too much into a tangent, but the diversity of different life on Earth is really important since everything is interconnected. So invasive species are a big threat to that, mainly because they're usually going to kind of become a monoculture, which we'll talk about with some of these species, instead of having a diversity of vegetation like you would in a natural area. So with that, oops, there's my mouse. So what I kind of try to do this talk, instead of going into a huge amount of depth about every species and doing fewer species, I kind of try to give a brief blurb or little information about a lot of species with the idea that that would help kind of expand your knowledge of things to look out for, and say, if you have some of these plants in your landscape, you can look for more information. It's definitely out there. I'm also glad to provide more information. But you know, with some things, it's better to go more in depth into a few things. And with these, I don't think it's as important that you know everything about the life history of the species as to know as many species as we can get through. So our first species is coral ardesia. And I don't know if you've seen this, it's in the ornamental industry. It's very popular on the coast, but I imagine it's not limited there. It was introduced to the US from Japan and northern India, and it prevents native seedlings from establishing by shading the understory. So you can actually, if you Google this, you can look up pictures in Florida where there's wooded areas like natural woodlands where the understory is nothing but coral ardesia as far as you can see. So a lot of people plant it as an ornamental because it has these red berries that they think are pretty. I mean, it kind of is an attractive plant. It has these nice evergreen crenate leaves that kind of have that interesting shape on the edge. But there's definitely better plants you can plant. And one thing I will mention as we're going through these species too, is that a lot of these species are still sold in the ornamental trade, largely because Georgia is one of 4 states in the US that does not have a noxious weed law. So almost every other state, except us and 3 others, have laws that say that invasive plants cannot be sold in their state. It's really interesting for me being on the Florida line because I can go to Home Depot in Florida and they're not selling something because it's illegal there. And I can drive right back across to Georgia and they are selling something, like we'll talk about water hyacinth in a little while. And you can find it here because it's not illegal here. So when I say that, people always ask me, well, what can we do about that? We need a noxious weed law. What can we do about that? And really that would be writing to your legislators or starting a local campaign. The Georgia Department of Ag is who regulates that, but really it would be state legislature that would need to put that into law. And I can say that 1, that we're not allowed to lobby for anything, and 2, that nobody listens to us when we go and talk to them about it. So, but if it's something that a lot of citizens feel strongly about, and also if you're seeing native plants sold by a nursery or a big box store, consumers have a very important voice as well. So saying, hey, I don't like that you're selling this here. This is invasive. You shouldn't be selling this. If they're hearing that from enough customers, it will have an impact as well. So just a side note. So their next species is lantana, and this might be the one that makes me the least popular because nobody likes to hear that lantana is invasive. In fact, I even have family members that argue with me about this. But lantana, most lantanas are invasive. If you have to plant a lantana, plant one that is a single color bloom. Those are less invasive. Some of them are not known to be invasive. But the best thing is just avoiding lantana in your landscape. The ones that are the most popular, unfortunately, like this one in the picture here, I think some of them are called things like candy tuft. They are the ones that are very invasive. They were introduced to the US from the West Indies as an ornamental. They like to invade disturbed areas and crowd out native species. And also another thing to keep in mind about lantana is that the leaves and the fruit, unripened fruit, are poisonous. And so that's to dogs, to children. You know, personally, I try not to put many poisonous things in my lawn or in my garden, you know, especially if it doesn't serve a real purpose. And, you know, the thing with a lot of these invasives too, you don't always see their spread. I know this is an argument I've had with some family members before, because they say, I've watched it for years and it gets a little bigger and I prune it back, but it never goes anywhere. But this plant has berries, and things eat the berries, and things, you know, spread those berries other places after they go through their digestive tract. So you don't always see the spread that happens with invasives. Nandina is the next one that people a lot of times have a lot of affection for. Personally, I've always thought this was an ugly plant, but I know a lot of people have sentimental attachment to it, with my own mother, because my grandmother always grew it. I have seen this plant spread, like being planted near a house and then several acres away in the woods, coming up randomly. Because again, the berries. It was introduced to the US from China and Japan. And another important thing, if you like your songbirds, is that the berries contain cyanide. And if songbirds eat enough of those berries, it can kill them. There's several cases, especially a few years back. I know it made the news a few times in the metro area. I actually want to say it might have been DeKalb County, but I may be remembering that wrong. But it was one of the metro counties where there was like a mass death of cedar waxwings. And that's because cedar waxwings like to gorge themselves when they find a food source. So for any bird that's going to just consume a lot of berries at a food source, that they collect enough cyanide that it's lethal for them. So Nandina, of course, not the best choice. Something native with berries is going to be much better, whether it's a holly or beautyberry or something of that nature. It was Decatur. Yep. So DeKalb County. Perfect. So we'll talk about a couple different privets here, but the first one on a slide is our glossy privet. It was introduced to the US from Asia. It forms dense thickets and outcompetes desirable plants. It produces a lot of seeds, which allows it to spread more easily and makes it more difficult to eradicate. So we'll talk about glossy privet and Chinese privet. Chinese privet's the one that gets the most attention usually. Honestly, I don't recommend planting any privets. I think there are natural native alternatives that are much more desirable and beneficial to the ecosystem. But I will say not all privets are known to be invasive. There are some other species that are used. I don't recommend them to my clients. I always recommend they make a better choice if they're open to that. But the ones you definitely want to stay away from are glossy privet and then Chinese privet, which we'll talk about. So I think elephant ear is one that a lot of people don't realize is invasive. And, you know, I'll be honest, I don't think I realized it was invasive until I moved to the coast. It was introduced to the US from Northern South America. And of course, it has these big, crazy leaves and the ability to grow really tall, about 9 feet tall, which means they can shade out native plants. But it's also why a lot of people like it in the landscape. You know, it's a really interesting, different looking plant, but it is very invasive. It spreads profusely in the landscape and especially in wet areas. So I know DeKalb is not as wet and humid as we are down here on the coast, but we have some great examples of what this plant can do down here. In the town that my office is located in, every single drainage ditch and every single wetland is choked out or at least has this plant in it. But most of it is just completely full of elephant ear. They also float easily. In fact, we put in a bioretention stormwater management cell in front of our office with a rain garden and native planting. And I actually had to dig out some elephant ear that came up because I think it actually washed in with some of the rain. So I would definitely, if you've got it in your landscape, take it out while you still can, and avoid planting it if at all possible. Yeah, I see someone says they have theirs in a container. With any of these plants, if you are going to have them, or you can't let them go for some reason, a container is going to be best. And if it's anything that produces berries or seeds, you're going to want to remove those and destroy them, either by bagging them well and sending them to the landfill, or burning them. We don't want to compost them because they'll spread. Most home compost is not hot enough to kill seeds. But yeah, I mean, I recommend getting rid of them, but if you have to have them, keep them in a container. Anything with berries or seeds, remove those immediately when they come on and destroy them. So rattlebox is another one that we see a lot in disturbed areas. It was introduced to the US from South America. It displaces native vegetation and wildlife and forms really dense thickets. Excuse me, that was kind of hard to get out. It has this flower that a lot of people find desirable, and it's a pretty flower, and the picture doesn't really do it justice as far as its color. It's a really kind of deep orangey red, and it does have a pretty flower and kind of a unique growth structure, but it will literally just take over, especially in newly cleared areas. I don't see this a whole lot in the home landscape. I see it more in natural areas, but it's one to be aware of for sure. Mexican petunia is popular more in some areas than others of Georgia, but a lot of people do like it as an ornamental. It was introduced to the US from, no shock, Mexico and South America. It's a popular landscape plant, but it's very aggressive and crowds out native plants. There are better petunia options. If you want a petunia looking flower, not that they're native, but there are more innocuous options out there. This stuff colonizes really easily and takes over areas. Sword fern. So we have a lot of different native ferns that honestly, I think all of them are prettier than this fern. This is the least attractive fern in my personal opinion, but it was introduced to Georgia from Asia and Australia, and it'll take over low growing mats and form impenetrable dense stands. I see this a lot of times where people like to create a border with it, but then that border doesn't stay a border. It just kind of takes over. So vinca, or periwinkle, this one comes as a surprise to a lot of people. It was introduced to the US from Europe and West Asia. Again, it forms extensive mats along forest floors and displaces native plants. Personally, I have experience with this one as I lived for a handful of years in Knoxville, Tennessee for work. And we had 2.5 acres next to a natural area, 10 minutes from downtown, very idyllic in a lot of ways, except that someone at some point in the past, since it was very steep in areas, had planted this vinca, probably just, as a ground cover to keep erosion from happening, but it had spread and it took over the entire forest floor. So we had 2.5 mostly wooded acres, and all of our woods, the understory was nothing but vinca. It was just choked out with vinca. And it was very difficult to try to manage or get rid of at that point, especially since it had also spread into the natural area that was publicly owned adjacent to us, so it would keep coming back even if we were able to eradicate it on our property. So, really one to be aware of there. It will really take over. I see someone else is saying, yeah, they have it in their backyard. It definitely spreads. It does. And if it is not, the sooner you keep it in check, the better you'll be, because it will form really, really dense mats that are hard to get rid of. How can this be removed? So we'll talk a little bit at the end about removal and kind of multi-pronged strategies. But if I don't cover that well, then ask me that again. Skunk vine, this is probably not one you've dealt with before, but just kind of have it on your radar. It was introduced to the US from Asia. It can survive in a variety of habitats and become so dense that tree branches or even whole trees can collapse under its weight. We have had this in our county. I haven't dealt with it personally. I've had one property with it, and they said that it earns its name. So you'll find that with a lot of names, scientists are not super creative. A lot of our names are very descriptive. So you can imagine skunk vine is rather unpleasant to deal with and to physically remove because it's got a lot of odor with it. Air potato is one I've done a lot of work with down here on the coast, but you also have it in North Georgia. It's spread as far north as North Carolina. Last I checked, that was a few years ago. It was introduced to the US from Africa, and it smothers other plants by restricting sunlight, and it disrupts processes such as water flow. So this air potato, it has a very pretty leaf, a pretty heart-shaped leaf. This is one of those that I've had lots of people say to me, well, I couldn't grow anything else, and this plant has just done great for me. We actually have a flea market near Savannah where apparently somebody loves this plant so much because it's the only thing they can grow that they give it to everybody who comes in the flea market. And there are still nurseries that sell this as well, unfortunately. It is a vine. And I do want to make a disclaimer that we have plenty of native vines that are aggressive, but they're not invasive. So not all vines are invasive because I get a lot of questions about that too. But this vine is, it can grow up to 8 inches a day. And then at every leaf node, growing at 8 inches a day, mind you, it puts out one of these, they're called bubbles. But it's what it gets its name for because it looks like a little potato up in the air. Each of those drops down and grows a new plant. So you can imagine this is a very prolific plant. It's also very hardy. So when we started working with this plant in 2015, I think it was, myself and a colleague from the Georgia Forestry Commission actually collected, when we were out working, we each grabbed one of these little bubbles to, use for demonstration purposes educationally. So this sat in my office, no soil, no water, no nutrients of any kind. And over the next several months, it grew a vine that was 6 feet long, entangled my microscopes, and put out new leaves and started putting out new bubbles at every leaf node. And it did all of that just from the carbohydrate reserve that was in that bubble. My colleague at Georgia Forestry Commission had the same thing happen, and he didn't even have sunlight in his office. He didn't have a window or anything. So this is a very tenacious plant. Those bubbles can float as well and spread to new areas. So it can be kind of difficult to remove, but unfortunately is still being planted as an ornamental. English ivy. I'm hoping English ivy is not as popular as it used to be. It used to be really popular. I remember in my childhood, we had it along a retaining wall. It was introduced to the US by European colonists as a year-round ground cover, but it is a very aggressive invader, and it can weaken or kill infested trees and shade out understory plants. My parents' house that was further north in North Georgia, they had 38 acres, and their neighbor across the road had English ivy planted at some point. The neighbor's property, it covered all of the ground in their property in their front yard, choking out trees, and somehow came across the road and started coming up on my parents' property as well. Yeah, Pat says, got these two, they're a pain. They are a pain. English ivy can be difficult to get rid of. It's definitely worth the fight though. And you definitely don't want to introduce this into your landscape. Yep, Beryl says it produces seeds once the vine goes vertical. Yeah, so it's very reproductive and it's very tenacious. So if you have it, get on top of it. Hard to kill. Yep, a lot of these, and that's it's an interesting point. Hard to kill. All of this stuff is hard to kill, and I will tell you, it's hard to kill. That's part of what makes it invasive. I was giving a talk at a native plant sale for one of our local nonprofits several years ago, and I was talking about pollinators, I think. But anyway, somebody stood up in the audience afterwards and said, "Are you the one that released the air potato beetles?" Because we were working on a biocontrol with air potato. And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And this was probably a month or two after we had released the biocontrol. And she said, "Well, we still have air potato, right?" And I said, "Well, yes." There's no magic cure. There's no silver bullet. you know, this is one of our strategies to manage this species and to try to get it under control, but it would not make it disappear overnight. So a lot of these are going to be really hard to get a hold of. I see somebody ask about goats. Goats can be a useful tool. We'll talk about integrated pest management, which is basically incorporating different strategies to try and address these issues, because one strategy alone is probably not going to take care of it. All right. So our next one is Japanese honeysuckle. I know everybody probably has a story about Japanese honeysuckle from their childhood and like to suck the nectar out of the flowers. We do have a native honeysuckle, which I think is actually a lot prettier. It's got red tubular flowers. Hummingbirds love it. It's called Lonicera sempervirens, or a common name for it is coral honeysuckle or the woodbine vine. It's actually on the logo of our county seat because it's named Woodbine. So Japanese honeysuckle was introduced to the US from Japan as an ornamental, and it outcompetes understory plants and some other small trees and shrubs. So, you know, a lot of this is the same story kind of over and over again with these different plants. So there are other honeysuckle options. There are native vine options that flower as well outside of honeysuckle. Or crossvine. But again, if you're looking for a honeysuckle, the coral honeysuckle, very pretty, and the hummingbirds love it. So our next one is Chinese or Japanese wisteria. Now there is an American wisteria that is native. It is less showy. It's similar. It has the same type of flower, but it is less showy. Most of what you're going to see like on roadsides, or if it's just taking over and super, as one of my colleagues, as a plant biologist, says, gaudy. He likes to use the word gaudy to describe plants like Japanese wisteria. But there is an American wisteria that you can find at native plant sales a lot of times. It's a little less showy, but it's still very pretty plant, similar flowers, or pretty much the same flowers, just a little smaller. So there's definitely some options if you want that look in your landscape. But this was introduced, as I mentioned, from China and Japan. It kills native plants by aggressively shading and strangling them. If you've seen it much on like roadside areas or wilder areas, a lot of times it's choking out trees. So definitely one to kind of try to work out of your landscape if possible. Chinese tallow. I don't know how many people in your area plant this ornamentally, but it is still planted ornamentally. It is on the coast, it is our biggest invasive single issue if we had to pick one. This stuff's kind of the bane of my existence. It was introduced to the US from China. It has really fast growth and crowds out native species. It has about 100,000 seeds per tree. It also changes the soil chemistry and is toxic and causes vomiting in both cattle and humans. We also know this plant as popcorn tree because it produces these little pods that look like popcorn, basically. You know, I know some people that have this as a specimen tree in their lawn, unfortunately, you know, or in their landscape, unfortunately. But Chinese tallow is definitely one that you want to work to get rid of if you have it in your landscape or near you. Like I said, very prolific. I've seen it spread from neighbor to neighbor and come up in pots, and it's a nasty little bugger. In fact, my husband and I went down to some springs in Florida over the weekend, and we were at a state park, and I saw this coming up along the Swanee River, which was really frustrating. My poor husband, he's probably so frustrated because everywhere I go, I'm like naming bad invasive plants that need to be gone, or, you know, even invasive animals that are around. So, but luckily he's a very patient man and interested usually. So mimosa, excuse me. Mimosa is one that most people know by now is invasive. And most people know it was introduced to the US from China. It invades disturbed habitat, of course, reducing sunlight and nutrients for native plants. I personally don't consider it the biggest threat in this list, but it's also not a desirable plant to have in your landscape. It does have these kind of frou-frou flowers. I don't know how to describe them. They look kind of like fireworks, I guess. They can be pretty. But we also do have some native plants, different growth structure, but native plants, like sensitive vine is, well, there's a few things that are known by that name, that common name, but that have similar flowers, if that's kind of what you're after. And then other trees that would have similar growth forms. Camphor tree was introduced to Florida from China and Japan. I don't know if it's made it as far north as you guys are yet, but it's good to be on the lookout for it. It was brought over for camphor production. It grows and produces seed quickly and takes over an area quickly. And they're kind of stinky, or they smell good, depending on your feelings about camphor. And a lot of these, that if maybe you're not seeing them yet, being aware that they're in the area or that they may be coming is an important thing too. We try to keep an eye out for things that might be coming up from Florida that are a problem, or from other areas, because that also allows us to do what we call early detection and rapid response, which is abbreviated as EDRR. But with a lot of these, if you recognize it when it comes, it's going to be a lot easier to get rid of early on than if it fully establishes before you realize it's a problem. So this is one that's been very popular over the last few decades. I'm hoping it's falling out of grace. Calorie pear, which also you know as Bradford pear. It was introduced to the US from China as a sterile flowered ornamental. So it's supposed to be sterile. But as more and more people planted it and increased genetic diversity, it has led to plants that are not sterile and with substantial thorns and viable seeds that invade a lot of areas, including old fields and forest edges. My understanding is these thorns are big enough and tough enough that they'll puncture a tractor tire. So we're not talking about little thorns. There are lots of pictures of it taking over areas, natural areas, fields, all sorts of things, very difficult to get rid of. Aside from that, I mean, this just isn't even the best landscape tree. It smells like cat urine when it flowers. I mean, the flowers are pretty, but that's not exactly what I want to smell from my landscape personally. I always thought it was interesting because my high school actually had this planted in the courtyard that we would go out to at lunchtime from the cafeteria. And whenever it was blooming, everybody's like, oh, I don't really want to eat out here. It smells like cat pee because no one wants to, smell that. They're also really like poor structured trees. They're not very strong. They break easily. They're prone to damage. So really some better landscape trees to consider than a Bradford pear. So Kogan grass, I like to put this in here just so everybody's aware. I don't expect that you would have this in your home landscape. It was introduced to Alabama, introduced first to Alabama from Asia. It's very flammable, it poses a fire hazard, it's harmful to wildlife when ingested. I think they initially brought it over as a forage for cattle, but the blades are sharp and will cut the animal's tongue. It also has these stolons that are super sharp and will puncture equipment tires and tractor tires. So it's very difficult to manage. It can also, as it says, is highly flammable. So if it comes up a lot of times in forested, like planted pine areas, it can be really detrimental because they can't do control burns. And if a fire starts, it basically gets too hot and burns up the trees. Kogan grass is regulated in the state of Georgia. Luckily, the Georgia Forestry Commission got on top of it really early on. So if anyone in the state of Georgia, anywhere in the state of Georgia, has Kogan grass or suspects it, they can call their local Georgia Forestry Commission office. They will actually come out and see if it's Kogan grass. And if it is, they will treat it until it is eradicated. They'll come back year after year until it's completely eradicated free of charge, because that's how concerning and important this species is to deal with. It has been extremely harmful in some neighboring states like Louisiana and I think maybe Mississippi, but they like to stay on top of that one. But I like to put it out there for everybody's awareness. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different species. We of course haven't covered all of them, but hopefully, there was a few new things for everybody. And looking at the questions in the chat or the comments in the chat, it looks like a lot of people there were things that they didn't know were invasive. And I see somebody says, I did not plant any invasive species that are at my house. That happens all the time. A lot of times you buy a piece of property and, you know, it's a constant struggle of trying to get the bad things out of the landscape and put some newer things in or change it up to your style even. But yeah, there's a lot of, I never blame anybody. I actually was doing an invasive species talk for a brown bag session at DNR, the Department of Natural Resources one time. So these were all DNR folks. And when I talked about air potatoes, somebody was like, I planted that in my yard and it does so well. And I didn't know it was invasive, you know, and like she felt so guilty and ashamed. I was like, it's okay. Now, you know, you can move forward. It's all right. So, you know, we're all constantly learning, and, you know, being open to knowledge, I think, is the most important thing. So what can we do? You know, we know these plants are invasive. What can we do? The first thing is not buying invasive plants. So, you know, a lot of this is just about doing some research. And if you're looking into plants, or maybe you see some plants that you're really interested in, but you've never heard of them before, you know, doing a quick search, trying to see if they've been invasive in places and whether they'll be an issue or not. If you're planting native plants, you don't even have to worry about that. And just a little plug for native plants, not that everything has to be native, but native plants are going to be the least work for you, the least expense for you, and they're going to do best in your environment, and they're also going to provide the most nutrition for your native pollinators and your native wildlife. So they're going to give the most back to the habitat, because if you think about it, each ecosystem, the organisms in there, they evolve together over time. So, you know, when you're planting things that don't belong in that ecosystem, even if they're not harmful, they're not contributing. So planting things that are native are going to do the most to contribute to that ecosystem health and to having pollinators and birds and any other, you know, insect diversity, all that fun stuff. So, all right. There's some more questions coming in. I'll get to the other questions in just a second, because I'm going to finish up this one slide. So another thing is not sharing invasive plants. So if you have them in your landscape, like we talked about, if you have invasive plants, first off, it'd be best to get rid of them. And if you're getting any plant parts or seeds or flowers, you either want to bag them, seal the bag, and put them in the landfill, send them to the landfill, or if possible, safely, you can burn them. Do not compost them. They'll still be viable in a home compost pile. Definitely don't dump them in the woods somewhere, or, you know, in a lawn pile somewhere, or, you know, for limb pickup or anything like that, because they're just going to get spread around. So if you have invasive plants, don't share them with others, and don't share plants if you're not sure if they're invasive or not. Remove them from your landscape. If you're not willing to remove them from your landscape, keeping them containerized is not 100% safe bet, but it's better. And then also, again, removing seeds, fruits, any of that as soon as it comes on to minimize the spread. But ideally, what we want you to do is get rid of them, or work to get rid of them. So there's a couple of different strategies there. What we recommend is called an IPM strategy, integrated pest management. So basically, there's no silver bullet with any problem that we have in the landscape. Things take work and, you know, sometimes a multi-pronged strategy. So with invasives, we usually want to physically remove the plants, as much of the plant and the plant product as we can. So plants, roots, debris, and we want to, like I said, either bag it and trash it or burn it. For most of these plants, spraying them with a high concentration of glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in the original Roundup. I understand that Roundup's calling some other things Roundup now, or triclopyr. This will take more than one application. Follow the label, the label's the law. So with a lot of this stuff that's rather tenacious, you're gonna need a higher concentration. Things that are woody, what you can do is actually cut them close to the ground, and then within a few minutes, I mean, pretty quickly after you cut them, you can paint that herbicide on there, And that way you don't have to spray and worry about drift or spray extra areas or things like that. I did just realize that Chinese privet was not in this talk, and I think this one may have been, I've got a couple of these, and I think this one I may have left it out of because we don't see it much on the coast. Chinese privet is bad. Any kind of privet, but Chinese privet is probably the worst. It is, especially in North Georgia, it has taken over so much of the woods and forested areas and natural areas. The berries spread the seeds, but it also has super tenacious roots. When I lived in Knoxville, it's a problem there too, but when I was living in Knoxville, we were fighting privet, and I would pull up even just little tiny plants, and the roots, each root would go out for 6 feet in every direction. I mean, it's just such an intense plant. Trying to get rid of it, pulling it. If you can't pull it, again, this cut stump treatment, so cutting it, painting it with an herbicide, either a strong concentration of glyphosate or triclopyr is a good one for woody plants. It just has more soil activity, so you have to be careful, follow the label. But, you know, and if you have questions about specific plants, feel free to reach out to me or Yanni. And, you know, if we don't know, we'll find out the answer. But that's going to apply to a lot of the things that we talked about today, but trying to remove that vegetative material, as much of it as possible, manually, whether you have to cut it out or pull it out, as much as you can get out physically is really your best strategy. But it won't be a one-time deal. None of this will be a one-time deal. That's why they're invasive, because they're really hardy and they can withstand a lot of stress and, you know, abuse. And another thing is educating others. So sharing the knowledge. If you're really interested in invasive species issues too, there is a reporting app called EDDMaps, EDDMA, I think it's 1P, EDDMaps. You can Google it, it comes right up. It's hosted by the University of Georgia, but it's a statewide app. If you see something that you suspect is invasive, or that you say, I'm pretty sure this is air potato vine, you can take a picture with your phone on the app and put in like the information that you know. It'll log GPS coordinates and it'll send it to an expert that is on the app that will verify whether it's actually what you think it is or not. But the more that we track how far invasives have spread and how much problem we're having with them, the easier it will be to get funding to fight them and legislation to help manage them better as well, hopefully. Because you gotta have some data to back up what you're saying. And that's a continual fight. So with that, I know we've got some questions in the chat that I'll go to. And if you have any other questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or unmute yourself. I will give a quick plug too, if you enjoyed this. We just launched in March a statewide program for sustainable landscape certifications. It's called the Georgia Green Landscape Stewards Program. And it's a statewide program. It has 10 educational components. They vary from things like biodiversity and welcoming wildlife to stormwater management and native plants and invasive plants. And the talk on there is another version of this one. So if you wanted to either go back and see it again or look at a PDF of it, it is available on the website as a PDF, but also as a pre-recorded video presentation too, if you're interested. So, and also just if you're interested in more things about sustainable landscaping, and you can certify your landscape and get a cute sign that says you have a Georgia green landscape. All right. So, question, if you rid your space of invasive plants, how long before the soil is safe to grow food in? There's no reason that it shouldn't be safe to grow food in, unless you're using some really toxic herbicide. But if you're following the herbicide, even if you're using an herbicide, if you follow the label directions, it should be safe once you've got that plant gone. And if there was any interval there, it should say it on the label. because the label's the law and all the precautions should be there. But as far as just if you were physically removing it, there's no harm that it should cause necessarily. So I wouldn't be concerned about that. All right, so Jane says, what about jasmine? So if you're talking about jasmine and not jessamine, because sometimes I hear them used interchangeably, Carolina jessamine is native. It has a yellow tubular flower. There is an ornamental jasmine. I don't know if it is invasive. I have not seen it on an invasive list. I know it can be rather aggressive though. So I'm honestly, I'm not gonna say one way or the other because I'm not 100% sure and I don't want to mislead anybody. All right, somebody says, I missed the first few minutes of the presentation. Is purple passion plant on the list? If you mean passion flower, also known as like maypops that have a little fruit on them, it is not invasive, it's native, if that's what you're referring to. Passion vine is a native. It just, like a lot of vines, can be very aggressive, but it's also the host plant to Gulf fritillary butterflies, and the fruits are edible. So there's that. What about bamboo? Yes, bamboo is invasive. I actually had a client argue with me about this the other day. There's clumping bamboos and running bamboos. Running bamboos are much worse. They are much more invasive than clumping bamboos, but clumping bamboos are still considered invasive. It's very hard to get rid of them. They do alter the ecosystem. They're not native here. River cane is the only type of bamboo that is native to Georgia. But yes, bamboo is invasive. Are Lenten rose and tall coreopsis typically invasive? No, I've never heard of a problem with Lenten rose. And I mean, there are some plants that can be aggressive, you know, that they can spread easily, but they're not invasive. And I don't know if tall coreopsis is native, but a lot of our coreopsises are coreopsises, I don't know, are native. So I'm not aware of either of them. And thank you, Yanni. Yanni put in the EdMaps link in the chat, which is perfect. I was going to do that myself if I didn't, you know, once I got to it. And she also put in the link for the Georgia Green Landscape Stewards website, if you're interested, which answers Dot's question, which is the name of the identifying app. It is in the chat. Yanni put it up here. It's edmaps.org, and there is a link in the chat. All right, so the names of chemicals that kill English ivy. With English ivy, the hard thing is that you don't want to probably spray the tree that it's on. You could use glyphosate, which is the original Roundup. You could probably use that. You just want to be careful that there's not any injuries to that tree. So it is usually absorbed, it's foliar absorbed, so it works on the green parts of the plant. You just want to be careful if it's on a tree or anything. But then sometimes English ivy is on something like a retaining wall. So it really depends on where your English ivy is. I would probably pull it off the surface first too. And you may have better luck. You know, personally, I don't like to put a whole lot of, I try to avoid spraying anything in my landscape if I can. Not everybody is of that mindset, but so what I would recommend if you're able to is pulling it off whatever surface it's on, digging up as much of it as possible. And when it starts to come back and it's smaller, then just painting some glyphosate or Roundup on there, on those leaves when they come out. All right. So there's also a question, does concentrated vinegar kill any of these plants? So this is, in short, no, this isn't a good idea. It's possible that concentrated vinegar could kill them, but it will also do other damage. So vinegar can be a strong acid, and that can alter your soil pH. So really, it would be better if you're going to spray something to use something that's actually labeled for it. And I see you say that the big box stores are selling it. I'll be honest with you, the big box stores will sell anything you'll buy. just like they sell all kinds of wildlife repellent and none of them work. They're not, regulated in any way. The research shows they don't work, but people will buy them. So someone will sell them. I would not use vinegar in my landscape. Also, don't use salt. I know that's another one that has gotten, people say, oh, well, it kills the weeds. Well, yeah, because you're literally salting the earth, if you remember that reference from history. So I wouldn't use vinegar because that's going to also alter your soil pH and probably have very inconsistent results at best. Okay. What is the Vineyard program? So Yanni linked that up above as well. It's the Georgia Green Landscape Stewards program, and she linked to the website. Okay, and somebody says they've had problems with liriope at the Fernbank Forest. That's interesting. I have not seen liriope become invasive, but it will spread for sure. Not saying you're wrong, just haven't seen it become invasive or hadn't seen it listed on any list either. But can you smother ivy for 2 years? You could try it. You'll probably still get some back, but you can always try solarizing an area. If you've got an area where you can spread out black plastic and cover it up and the sun will hit it and you're willing to wait and see. I mean, it's worth a try. Really, again, your best bet's probably going to be just to be really tenacious on digging it out, unfortunately. I did not mention how to get rid of kudzu specifically. It's going to be the same as a lot of the others, and there's not an easy. Kudzu is one of those that it grows so fast. There's a lot of times not an easy answer. Pulling out, physically removing as much as you can, and then spraying it would also help. But there's not a good easy answer for kudzu, of course, which is why we see so many areas that are overgrown with it. Are wild orchids invasive? So I don't know specifically what species, but generally, as a generalization, no. So most things that, well, I don't want to say most things. A lot of things that you see growing wild or as wildflowers are your natives. If you're seeing them on roadsides and things like that. That's not always true because there are, disturbed areas or where new things come in. But a lot of the things that are growing wild are going to be native to your area. Yes. All right. Beryl says the Fernbank Forest tried various smother techniques for English ivy. None were effective. Yeah, I haven't seen any research on that, whether that would be effective or not. I mean, I know some people try it. It's definitely not the quickest way. All right, any suggestions or resources to find native ground cover plants for pathways? So one of the things that we have been working on through the Georgia Green Landscape Stewards program is coming up with more native plant resources for Georgia as a whole. So on the coast, we actually have a native plant search engine, but I think it mainly just covers coastal counties. Not that you couldn't use it, just that it would be maybe plants that weren't as appropriate for your area. They wouldn't be invasive, they just might not survive as well. I do believe that the State Botanical Gardens in Athens has some native plant lists as well. I know a lot of great coastal resources for that, but I have been told that the Georgia Native Plant Society and the State Botanic Gardens in Athens both have plant lists. So I think if you Googled either one of those and looked at their websites, you could find some good native plant lists that would be appropriate for the Piedmont. There are not any natural DIY herbicides that are effective, really, or research proven anyway. The natural thing, honestly, is to pull it. I mean, I would either spray something that is according to the label and that is regulated, or what I usually do, even though I don't always have the energy to keep up with it the way I want to, is just pulling things by hand. That's the natural DIY herbicide, unfortunately. right, so this is interesting. I'm learning about Liriope being issues in the Piedmont because somebody else says it's taking over my garden woods. So I'll have to look into that more. Is it better to get rid of invasive plants in what season? You know, honestly, now is the best time. Anytime that, as soon as you can is the best time. What is that saying about the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago? The second best time is now. It's kind of the same with invasives. So, you know, ideally, you definitely want to do it before it fruits or produces seeds for the year, but as soon as possible is the best time. All right, are there any natives that bloom from spring to fall frost that can replace lush blooms of petunias? So there are a number of natives. There are, yes. I would look again at the Georgia Native Plant Society and at the State Botanical Gardens for some lists that are appropriate for y'all's area. But there should be lists on there. And if there's not, shoot me an email or shoot Yanni an email, and we'll be glad to help get some more information. But yes, there are. There are natives for pretty much every season. All right, I think that was all the questions.